Welcome back to Maelstrom, the third phase. Today, our topic is centered around generational divides and how it connects to what we define as the third phase, with a few anecdotes about expanding upon how life is different typically for people in their 20s now versus when my dad and his generation and maybe his parents' generation were in their 20s, how they saw the world, how they viewed the future, and related topics. So, delving right into that, I want to ask you, so when you were 24, how did you see the future? Were you an optimist, pessimist, a drunk? Or did you think about the future? Or were you focused on the present? What would you say?
You asked about my parents' generation, and they were born in the 1930s. I was born in 1952. A lot of the bump of the economy and the optimism was created post World War II. There was tremendous amount of corporate startups and a number of other ventures that were started that lasted to the day. In my world, in particularly the 60s and 70s, we still had that sense of optimism because we didn't know any better. And in my case, I started out with a liberal arts degree in English and then evolved that into business. What I believe is that most people, since they weren't bombarded by all the distractions we have today, were able to focus more without some of those distractions or preconceived notions that social media creates for us. So for me, I didn't know how much I didn't know. And that's, I think, a core difference between now and 50 years ago. When I started out, I was of the belief that I could basically do about anything. I didn't see any limitations because I didn't really have a preconceived notion about what those barriers are going to be. Now I have a better understanding of them, certainly as I started running companies, but I think it's a totally different mindset. Optimism versus whether you want to call it current day zeitgeist, realism, or something else. It's different. So talk about that some, Griff.
I was gonna ask you, now growing up, I'm kind of like older Gen Z. I think Gen Z, the cutoff Gen Z, Gen Alpha is like 2010 or something. So I was like at the cusp of a Z and millennial, like a zillennial, right? So my childhood, I've always been put in a lot of like activities and stuff. I've grown around screens and computers and some social media, but not to the extent of Gen Alpha and soon to be Gen Beta. Gen Beta was born last year. So it's like on one hand it's great. Like we have instant access to a podcast on whatever niche topic you could possibly think of. And compare that to you growing up. Like you had what, like two channels? Like two TV stations that would end their content at a certain time, like a few radio stations. And now we have on demand anything. If you want to talk about that, and then I'll answer your question.
We did have limited content. We were living in a world where two and maybe three national stations were what we saw, and they did shut off literally at midnight. So the commentary we saw was much less robust than what we have now. The newscasters were trusted sources of information, particularly people like Walter Cronkite, who really was almost like a prophetic advisor to my generation because we didn't have the questions. Those came about in the late 1960s, thanks to North Vietnam. But one core difference is it was a different kind of isolation. When you think about the limited content, that's one issue. But bigger issue, I think, for this generation is the bombardment they have with a lot of negative media that comes in. News is tailored to an algorithm. We have the influence of social media, whether it's real or whether it's artificial. And we also didn't experience, in my generation, the effects of the pandemic. The pandemic probably is the biggest catalyst, other than the advent of social media like Instagram, on Griff's generation and the generations behind it, because they had basically a 2 year period of isolation where they solely relied on digital input. And that digital input was a lot driven by social media and not being participants in classrooms, right?
I did my freshman year of college fully remote during COVID. And for me, it was good. For us, it was good. Like, we really enjoyed our time together. We were in a fortunate position where we could enjoy our time together. But it's obviously a lot more difficult. Let's say you're a younger kid during COVID, and during those really key developmental milestones, I think a lot of those kids missed out and were forced to do Zoom class. And I think if you're a parent who's also working full time, concerned about job security during COVID, it's really hard to monitor your kids to make sure they're reading or doing their assignments or staying on task. I feel like, especially if you're a fourth grader, that's more difficult than me being a freshman in college. Even if I missed the first year of my quote unquote college experience, being 18 or 19 wasn't the same set of milestones being missed. We have all that and all this access to negative content online. I want to go back to what you said about Vietnam in the 60s. I understand that the stereotype I have of young boomers is wanting to, in some ways, not be like their parents and not essentially follow the cookie cutter, like suburban lifestyle. Would that be the greatest generation? What generation are your parents again?
My parents were technically the greatest
Yeah.
generation. The people that were born in the late 20s and early 30s, and a lot of them either directly or indirectly participated in World War II. And that was probably what we would say would be the equivalent of our pandemic. But coming out of that as a clear victory for the United States, it was a sense of optimism. There was a lot of people that gained a lot of good and bad experiences from World War II. So, just to complete the thought, the 1960s were a big period of evolution and change. One big, two big catalysts. One, the beginning of the sexual liberation, where the pill came into being, and people weren't as focused on some of the aspects of having sex. And the other thing was the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War was the first real questioning of where we were as a government and where we were as a people. Because a lot of people, 55,000, died in Vietnam, and there was never really a clear statement about the purpose of being there. And there was a lot of distrust about the information that was coming in through what before had been trusted media.
That's interesting because my generation has a lot of pessimism, skepticism of mainstream media and related sources. And I'm curious if we're comparing and contrasting my generation's skepticism versus yours during, 60s in Vietnam. You know, I mean, my perspective is your generations or close to your generation's skepticism still had a lot of hope and optimism underneath it, right? While in a lot of cases for my generation, I feel like so many people my age are so skewed. I mean, yeah, it's difficult right now with how uncertain things are, but they're so skewed by these negative perspectives online that are distorting their view of reality. I think it's good to be skeptical and question things, but if you're ignoring mainstream perspectives to only listen to fringe conspiracy theories that confirm whatever insecurities or fears you may have, that's not good either. That could be another topic as well. 60s were a very tumultuous time. They had the civil rights, as you said, sexual revolution, really high profile assassinations like JFK, MLK. Which time do you think is more uncertain or more tumultuous, the 2020s or the 60s, and why?
I think we have a lot more to compare with. If you look at the 60s, it was the beginning of a renaissance in music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, what became later heavy metal, growing your hair longer if you're male, sexual liberation, all those things were dynamic components and the beginning of the distrust for what the government and the media would tell people. But the reality was, underneath all that, there was still a sense of optimism because we hadn't been told that we were competing with electronic devices or with AI or with robots. Those were all things that were coming down later. And so, without that context, which I think is a really important word in a discussion like this, we were developing our own belief systems and our own way of looking at the world, but that was a slower evolution than being bombarded with infinite amounts of algorithmic driven news and pressure of social media. So our comparisons were regional as opposed to being international. If you look at the closest comparison, that would be the pandemic. And as Griff said, we were very fortunate. We lived right on the edge of a multi-mile trail system. So even at the height of the pandemic, we were able to get out of our house, we were able to go outside, we were able to do things. Where it really had impact were people that were in much more difficult urban environments. People that lived in Hong Kong or Shanghai or New York City or Los Angeles, where all of those traditional support networks, being in front of someone, being able to balance what you heard versus what you believed in, were much more crystallized during the pandemic. So we became less trusting and a little bit cynical, particularly about the military government complex. But on the other hand, we still could see the world as something that was still burgeoning after the post World War II era. Now, it's far easier for negative commentary and negative media to be a core part of our belief system, whereas then it really wasn't, right?
I'd assume that positive sentiment was because people were more unified back then, especially after a war. There's the sense of patriotism and togetherness that obviously doesn't exist right now. We're so divided right now because of these forces that we talked about. So I'm curious about your specific thoughts on that. With the civil rights movement, there was, of course, polarization. With Vietnam, there was polarization. But could you tell me from your perspective how different or the same political polarization has been from the 60s to now?
Well, I think the political polarization was driven by Vietnam and the civil rights movement, because if you look back, one major shift we saw was how the political parties were identified. Lyndon Johnson, who was brought in after John Kennedy was assassinated, turned out to be a fairly liberal president, even though he was from conservative, much more conservative now, Texas. So people were surprised at government mandates like the Civil Rights Act and other core things that we take for granted now. You know, when we celebrated the bicentennial of the, I'm sorry, 2076, we had a very different view of what patriotism meant. It was more of a celebration as below what is as opposed to what it's become now, which is political, more of a tribal event. So there were tribes back then, but they weren't as fragmented and distinct as they were back in the 1960s and 70s. So that's a core difference between now and then.
Yeah, there's probably more varieties and like weird fringe groups now because again, the internet, you could find whatever extreme beliefs you have and join that online. While, I'm sure those did exist in the 60s, but the access to people and information was different in terms of like echo chambers and conspiracism.
Well, that's correct. And, when we look at events now, we see events in real time. Back then, it was still much more current than it had been when it was primarily radio or print media. But the first Iran war was really the advent of in the field reporting. And the way things were communicated was really, as you look back on it, very restricted. For example, the number of people that were killed in Vietnam really weren't identified as individuals as much as a group. When you think about Afghanistan and periods of more recent wars, you had probably 5,500 or so people that were killed. In Vietnam, it was 55,000 people in round numbers. So it was an ongoing current event every day of bodies being flown back from Southeast Asia. Whereas now it becomes a much more specific dialogue and much more of a specific debate. The other thing to keep in mind is in the case of World War II, and I guess to most of the same degree, the Korean War, there were clear winners. Even though Korea was a little bit different, there was an end to the war. There was clear boundaries or zones set up. Now, if you look at Afghanistan, for example, when we departed there, it was a mess. And we enter into these conflicts that don't necessarily have to be never ending, but there's not a clear resolution. And that dissonance creates a whole different mindset and insecurity about what we see versus what's real or what's fake news. Let's call it fake media, custom media. So now we're bombarded with different stuff. And also, there's an underlying threat, specifically right now, artificial intelligence. Who knows how fast it's going to grow? Who knows how many jobs it's going to take away? Yes, it's creating opportunities for a select few, and it's also contributing to a massive growth in single person entrepreneurship. But now that sense of optimism, particularly for recent graduates, has gone away. Yeah.
It's impossible to generalize for everybody, but I think we're talking about the overall sentiment. Of course, there's variation on an individual basis, like any large sample size. But I think when you were in your 20s, you could feel the optimism in the air. And I think now I don't feel that optimism from my peers to the same extent. Of course, I wasn't around when you were in your 20s, but I'm making the assumption that it's a different vibe among young people now. Yeah.
There was a clear linear pathway that a lot of people went through, and that was getting a college degree. No matter what your college degree was in, it was a gateway to being even considered for something because it wasn't the majority of the people that were getting those degrees. There was also not the extreme cost, at least for most schools, particularly state schools, to get a degree. So now you have people that either in the process of getting degrees or in college or even in high school, where they've got massive amounts of distractions, and a lot of that distraction is negative. It's negative about what the future is going to hold because honestly, we don't know. We don't know about the impact of artificial intelligence and automation.
I agree. Well, you've talked about this before. So, what do people do about it? You said build your own brand. You said, I guess, be flexible, keep an open mind. I guess in some cases, if appropriate given your situation, learn skilled trades. Just, think on your feet. What would you say?
Well, we definitely have big, deeper segmentation of the economy. We call it the K-shaped economy, where people who have assets are able to either pull from those assets or watch them grow and not have the threat of being food challenged or not being able to buy a home. Now, because of incremental inflation and high growth of inflation in some periods, a lot of young people aren't really able to consider doing the basic benchmarks that we had, which is get married, have kids, buy a home, save for your kids to go to college, come out of college without two or three $100,000 in debt. And now there's this dispute or dialogue, is a better way to say it, about whether young people should even go to college. With AI able to do many things and more in the future, what do they get out of college? Do they learn skills? Do they learn to think? Hopefully, the latter they can.
I mean, I'm saying this as someone, I advocate for college. I have two college degrees. I think you can learn skills, you can learn how to think, you can network out of college too. It's these institutions that once had so much leverage. I think that's also arguably changing right now as well.
It's not the validation it was once before. And it's not only AI, it's increasing amount of outsourcing and decentralized manufacturing. It's the advent of automation throughout many jobs that would have considered to be static working for a corporation. So between automation, robotics, and the advent of AI, all of those things create a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Plus, we're very tribal. we're not only tribal between Republicans and Democrats, as recent elections have shown, we're tribal even within parties like the Democrats and Republicans. The difference between MAGA or Democratic Socialists are become bigger and bigger ends of the spectrum where people are reacting to that insecurity and their distrust of what their future holds. We're told that Social Security may not be around in 20 years. We're told that the jobs that we traditionally have trained for may not be around. Does that mean doom, apocalypse? No. But it really depends on how many resources you've got, how much time you have, and skill sets to basically build your own brand.
I want to be an optimist, and also provide tangible action steps for not only people in my position, but just in general. So, okay, build your own brand. Who the hell knows about college? So, what do we actually do about it? I say just, of course, it's dependent on the individual. Take action. I mean, I'm prone to this yesterday too, getting stuck in my own thoughts, feeling like it's so difficult to get the momentum in that deep work state. Hardest part's getting started. But from my perspective, things may be getting harder, but that's out of our control. Got to have the internal locus of control. Take action. Think about where we want to be in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, and just move.
What you're talking about is skill set portability.
Yeah.
And
Well, whether it's skill sets, relationships, other things, I feel that action is better than over analysis. And I'm an analyzer, but analysis only does so much good.
we're in a period of too much analysis, according to my belief. A recent study showed that population growth slowed with the advent of iPhones. And it's because I think, whether we were just naive or stupid, we didn't think about people getting pregnant. We didn't think about decisions that you could make on a whim on social media that might ruin your life for infinity and beyond.
Yeah, you recently, I guess we watched it together. I watched it for the first time. You rewatched it, the Netflix miniseries Adolescence, and that's an example of what we're talking about. It's a vignette of how distorted views from social media could radicalize people into acting in extreme ways. That's a part of it, and also the fact that anything like when you were in your teens and 20s, like you could do silly things or hang out with your friends and just be in the moment. Just focus on what you're doing then and there. What's different now is everyone has a phone, everyone's recording. Like, even if you're at a party, you have to be careful in how you act, what you say, because that could be posted on social media or revealed to future employers and then permanently cut you out of certain opportunities. And that connects over to what we said about analysis, where this legitimate fear of saying the wrong thing and having it get recorded forever has legs to it. But if that's taken to the extreme, where we're stuck in our own heads and don't do anything and we're not socializing, we're not taking any risks, then I'd say that's even more harmful than the potential downsides of getting some embarrassing clip shared on social media.
Yeah.
So that goes back to taking action, I'd say.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
We analyze everything. Kids are concerned about whether they're doing the right thing by opening the door for someone, whether they should have a drink or not. There's a certain comfort in being unaware and not having a lot of input to make decisions. So it is a paralysis. And on the other hand, a significant amount of it is real. It's a real concern about, can I commit to having a family? Can I find enough capital without having to borrow from my parents to buy a home? And, we're creating an environment that's, frankly, a lot more like Asia now, or what parts of Europe are like, where, multi-generational families living together isn't viewed as a failure. It's viewed as a way of life. The good side is, and I'm talking with Griffin about this today, because we do have three other businesses that we own or are operating, is that just like in engineering, where what Griff can do now would take in a team hours or days, Same thing with business. What would take me weeks and lots of cost in developing something, now I can do on my own and feel pretty validated about the information.
And, that's a really good segue into another conversation topic, and that's as an engineer, or in your case, as an operator, we could use these AI tools like junior employees that report to us. We could create sub agents and they coordinate with each other. And there's better and better, at least in the software space, like orchestration layers that are able to handle more accurate context management between employees in an organization, or orchestration layers between sub agents. So a whole bunch of nerdy jargon. But the point is that we're able to have significantly more output as a smaller team, or as an individual, or as what they call a solopreneur, compared to before. But that connects to the prior point about over analysis, because my bias as an engineer, and he knows this very well, is I want to test, validate, perfect everything. Because when you're building a bridge, you want to do that. You want to make sure the bridge doesn't collapse. Or when you're building software, you want to think about all these different edge cases and make sure it works under all these different stress tests, basically, which is great. You want to sell a product that works. But if that mentality, I have to be aware of this in myself, if that mentality is taken to the extreme, then you're not going to sell anything. You're going to be in your own world, stuck in, once again, analysis. Even with these AI tools, they're in some ways getting better, but they're built to be sycophantic and help confirm whatever biases you may have already. So that's why, whether on the software development side or being a business operator, these AI tools are great. But we also have to get out of our own heads, get out of that conversation with Claude, and get out there in the real world and talk to people, whether through networking, whether through talking to investors or potential clients. Because as much as I want to, in some ways, I cannot be engineering all the time. I have to set deadlines and then move on from certain functionalities.
Well, I think part of the problem now is we have skill sets, some of them artificial, but allows anybody to become a solopreneur, or however you want to describe it. The problem is a lot of young people seem to lack context. They lack the ability to truly understand how what they're trying to do operates in today's very different environment. They have assumptions, but one of the few advantages of being older is that you learn that every crisis is not catastrophic. So
What's your catchphrase?
my catchphrase is, well, I actually have two. One is from my mother-in-law, which says things change, and the other one, which has served me well, is deal with it.
You learn how to, both phrases, but especially the second one, I'd say that you've learned how to deal with it. You've learned how to let things go and not overanalyze whatever. Part of that is with age and experience. Like, someone like me, or, given my background, could be knowledgeable about AI or software or whatever, but I don't have the life experience that you do. Learning how to pattern match or deal with difficult people.
And part of being able to say that things change, so deal with it, has a tinge of arrogance to it because in order to do that, you have to have the time, and in some cases, many cases, you have to have adequate resources. And fortunately for me, my career evolved during a period where I was able to acquire skills. I had a long opportunity of learning while I was working. And now we're dealing with very, very short timeline or the leash on what we're trying to do. If I look at my career, I worked basically for high net worth families and partnerships, and I was able, because of my relationships, to build a business, expand a business, pivot when needed to. Now those timelines are so compressed.
Although I want to expand on that and connect the last part of what you said into how we define resources, because on the surface, we only define resources as capital, or as like financial capital, money. But I'd say those relationships you had and knowing how to build connections in the business world or just general social relationships, I think those skills are becoming even more important now because, like, from a software standpoint, AI is great. Like, AI could have significant output that is actually substantive, but it's not going to replace those relationships, the social capital, whether it was in your prior businesses, those types of connections you have, or connections that we will continue to make. I feel like in the age of AI, we got to take action. We also have to focus on our social capital as well, because AI cannot replace that. You could talk to a chatbot and have it act like a therapist, but that's not going to be a stand-in for the social capital, the benefits that you got from the partnerships that you were in the past.
Well, absolutely. And, again, it's almost arrogant to say, but the biggest resource you have is time. You have the time to experiment, you have the time to not make short term stupid decisions because your life depends on it. And that resource, particularly if you've been around for three-quarters of a century, becomes the most precious commodity that you have. It doesn't matter how big your house is or what your historical legacy might be. The reality is you've got a decreasingly finite amount of time to be able to explore and learn and grow. That's why personally I love AI. You have to realize the shortfalls and you have to train your AI agent to be not so sycophantic where it tells you everything you say is correct. So what I would say is time is a factor, resources are a factor. I mean, you have tremendous amounts of obligations, whether it's mortgages or kids or student debt, that changes your perspective, your timelines, your reality. That said, the biggest danger a lot of young people face is that, as Griffin said, it's inertia. They're going to find ways and reasons not to do something because they've got so much input, either totally sympathetic, where someone's going to tell you, oh, it's great.
You're completely right.
You're completely right. Or you're going to have a lot of inputs that says you're completely wrong. And whatever you're trying to do isn't going to work. So it's complex. I mean, yes, the realities, love, hate, need for friendships, health, all those things are the same as they were 200 years ago. But what's different is how compressed we are in the time that we have to make decisions and execute those decisions and what our expectations are.
Where does that compression come from, you think? Does that have to do with the rate of change? Like, if you want to create a viable business, you have to act even quicker because with AI, if you're not acting quick enough, then whatever you may have built would be commoditized already. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of problem and opportunities are based on people's need to be portable. My phrase of build your own brand really is portability for whatever's going to come next. If you're not able to have the time or the resources to be able to create that portability factor for who you are and who you want to be, then it's very difficult, particularly if your focus is trying to put food in the family and pay for gas and service whatever lifestyle you've got.
So it seems that to summarize what you're saying in a few words, things change and deal with it.
Well, things change and things always occur that you have to deal with it. Challenge is figuring out how to deal with it. Not everyone's going to be able to go out and create their own business and have it successful. Everyone now has the tools to be able to assume they can do that. But if they can't marry that up with the right mentors or the right relationships, they're going to rely on an artificial environment that doesn't necessarily realistically help you address those concerns, coupled with the fact we're very, very tribal. We have people that have learned that they can pretty much say whatever they think. And that's not a bad thing always, but it is bad if you can't really get any coherence, if you can't get any agreement on how sectors are going to deal with what's next.
To connect to what you're saying there, of course, we don't want to overanalyze, but I think it's good to always have an air of skepticism And I'd say one important skill from my college degrees would be knowing how to vet information like an academic, in the sense it's important if you read a claim to verify and test it. Now, that can be taken too far where you're not getting anything done. For example, in the AI space, I'd say there are many grifters out there who are selling snake oil, where AI is very powerful, it could do a lot, but there are many organizations or groups that completely oversell what their software or what a certain workflow could do. They essentially sell the dream, which isn't a bad thing. It's good to be hopeful, but it's also important to not be misleading and literally lie to people either. And that kind of fits in with the broader topic of misinformation, not only in the AI grifter, crypto bro space, but also within the realm of politics or the news, how there's increased rate of spread of misinformation in general. And it's so easy to see like a post on X or read a headline and want to have that validate whatever beliefs you may have already, as opposed to rigorously vetting information, but also not crossing into over analysis. So, yeah, I'd say that kind of critical thinking is a benefit of the traditional education system. And that kind of critical thinking doesn't necessarily have to come from the traditional education system, but I think that's certainly a benefit of it.
Well, absolutely. And in these future episodes of Maelstrom Third Phase, we're going to look at the pluses and minuses and the complexity of us all being in this third phase, the way we think, the way we operate, and what that means to us. We're also going to be talking about some of the other things that we work on and how we think what we're doing fits what's next. So, Griff, we probably should wrap this up soon. So, what else do you want to close with?
I'd say it's good to be informed, but don't take it to the extreme where you're hyper vigilant. And, I have a theory that many centuries ago, we of course didn't have the same access to information. So it's easy to feel vigilant about like, oh, I have to know the truth. So I have to read all these like what are doomer posts or information from social media that really distorts the truth. It may feel like in the moment that you're discovering some hidden secret, whether it's about the state of the world or job market, whatever your insecurity is. I think it's really important to monitor, okay, I'm doom scrolling, I'm doing this. What triggered it? Why am I doing this? Did I have a bad day? Did I have a difficult conversation? And I'm using this behavior to, like, on the surface, regulate my nervous system, but really it's doing the opposite because it's like a numbing effect, right? I think to write down how is social media or doom scrolling making people feel and learning how to take action on things and not get stuck in the purgatory of being in your own head. Get out there, generic advice. And I also want to touch on this set of Deloitte studies here that I will cite in the description. Also, perspectives from Pew Research in 2025. This is the Deloitte 2025 Global Gen Z Millennial Survey. As you may expect, there's a much higher rate of Gen Z using generative AI in work in general and at their workplace as well. And as you go up in the generations through baby boomers, that rate of use goes down. But interestingly, amongst the boomers who are familiar with AI, there's a lower rate of distrust or distaste among boomers as compared to Gen Z. So the point is that Gen Z uses AI, of course, at a higher rate compared to boomers, but they're also generally more pessimistic about it compared to boomers that do use AI. Specifically among Gen Z, it's around 76 to 83% use Gen AI regularly, while 20 through 52% of boomers use AI comparatively. But it's a very different sentiment, and that may have to do with upbringing and that optimism that we talked about, and how maybe Gen Z is more wired for pessimism as compared to boomers, given such a massive changing technology.
Well, my final
Yeah.
thoughts on this are it goes back to resources and perspective. For my generation, at least for me, AI is great. AI allows you to explore and learn and do things that you couldn't do. So that creates part of the optimism. Whereas if you're at the beginning of your career, AI is a threat. It's the possibility of you being trained for something that's not going to be existent. But let's leave on a note of hope. AI is not going to replace everything. It's not going to replace who you are or what really works in the real world. It can be an impediment, but it also can be a tool. And basically, that's what it is, a tool. But it's much more robust than just automation or the other things that we've seen in the past. So I think that's it for me. We're going to be sharing some of the things that we're working on, further observation, further commentary. Anything you want to close with, Griffin?
I appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you for your time.
Well, your time, but also the audience's time too.
Well,
So I'll make that clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.